Everywhere you look in the world, you'll now see examples of fractals and holograms everywhere. And this is basically a holographic design of the cosmos, or a fractal design, which the Kabbalah has been promulgating for centuries now. What surprised me, I think, the most was the conflation that I was experiencing between Kabbalistic insights and contemporary science. According to the laws of quantum mechanics, all of reality, all of the cosmos is built through light, is recapitulated in each point of light. To me, this quantum entanglement is exactly the idea that the Kabbalah is trying to portray with the cross-cutting mode, where one sephirah, let's say the one I gave you, loving kindness, is turned on immediately throughout every aspect of the creation.
This particle, or whatever we call it, of consciousness, which is pervading everything, what Kabbalah says, will we ever be able to measure that, or it's not measurable in principle?
Well, I don't think it's measurable in principle, because I don't believe that consciousness is part of the physical world. The Kabbalistic view, I think, is more like dual aspect monism, where there is a physical side because the 7 lower sephirot are bodily, and the top 3 are the consciousness. So they're fused. It's not just consciousness. Perhaps the meandering of the cosmic web has something to do with a more grand form of consciousness, but of course this is just conjecture on my part.
What kind of advice would you give to your young colleagues, to your scientists on their path?
The advice I'd give to young students today in the sciences is basically what I alluded to a few minutes ago. Science is wonderful. You can learn a tremendous amount. It's a pathway to truth, but it's not the only pathway. And I refuse to accept that anything that isn't potentially falsifiable is not worth learning. As I mentioned, a huge part of our existence, maybe the most wonderful part, love, for example, go objectify, go measure it. Go find an instrument that measures exactly how much love that this husband has for this wife. Give it to me in numerical form. No. It's so that's my advice, is keep an open mind, allow for subjectivity to be viewed, construed as real as the objective universe. I truly believe that Einstein's quest for a theory of everything, where all the forces of nature are combined, will not be realized until this 5th axis of reality between Keter and Malchut, transcendence, spirituality, and its combination with the physical world. Until that axis is in place, we will not have a true theory of everything.
Welcome to Essential Foundation channel. In today's episode, we will be talking about Kabbalah, consciousness, and science with Professor Hyman Schipper. Dr. Schipper is a clinical neurologist and neuroscientist, and he joins us from his work at the Jewish General Hospital at McGill University in Montreal. A person cannot know the taste of sweetness until he tastes bitterness. Those who are pained by the suffering of good people, their iniquities are removed from the world. Charity is the tree of life. These are the quotes from Zohar, a fundamental literary work of Kabbalah. And so we'll be talking about it, and also about consciousness and science, with Professor Hyman Schipper. Dr. Schipper is a clinical neurologist and a neuroscientist, and he joins us from his work at the Jewish General Hospital at McGill University in Montreal. Hello, Dr. Schipper.
Hello.
Welcome, and thank you for taking time to talk to us about interesting topics.
Oh, my pleasure.
Before diving into what is Kabbalah, I wanted to ask you a more personal question. How did you get involved with it? How did it start for you?
Well, I grew up in an Orthodox Jewish home. My parents came after World War II. They came from Poland to Montreal, Canada. And I was always exposed to small snippets of the Kabbalah in what's called Hasidic philosophy and Hasidic literature, because on my mother's side, we're connected to a Hasidic dynasty called the Radziner Hasidic movement. So I was always seeing bits and pieces of Kabbalah in literature, Hasidic literature, but it was never really presented to me in an organized fashion until I was fortunate to meet a chaplain that came to our hospital by the name of Rabbi Raphael Afilalo, and he introduced me to the works of a great Kabbalist who lived in the 1700s. His name is Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. And when I started to learn the works of this rabbi called the Ramchal for short, I began to see the Kabbalah in a completely new light. It was extraordinarily organized. It was beautiful. And what surprised me, I think, the most was the conflation that I was experiencing between Kabbalistic insights and contemporary science. And that to me was very unexpected. It was thrilling. And I've been sort of exploring that avenue of study since that experience with the Ramchal, which was about 15 years ago, approximately.
And all this time you've been practicing Kabbalah?
Well, practicing is an interesting word here because there is a theoretical, conceptual Kabbalah, which I am very interested in. And then there is what's called the prophetic or practical Kabbalah, where individuals actually try to use the Kabbalah to manipulate nature. That is not my area of expertise. I'm more interested in the philosophical and the conceptual aspects of the Kabbalah. So I practice neurology, but I study Kabbalah.
Okay. I think that's the interesting point you're making, because when I was preparing for the interview, Kabbalah is such a buzzword these days. You probably know it, right? If you Google it, you can get any answer you want from, philosophy, religion, prayers to how to manifest your deepest dreams with Kabbalah.
Yeah. And you have to be very, very careful because there is a lot of misinformation about Kabbalah in the media. So one has to be very careful how you approach it. And it's highly recommended that you have a teacher, a mentor who's an authentic expert in Kabbalistic lore to guide you, because the material is very esoteric and it's easy to misconstrue it and sort of be led down the garden path, as it were, unless you're very, very careful. So not everything you'll find on YouTube is authentic. So that's what I would say about that.
But what is it? Is it religion? Is it philosophy? Is it cosmology, theology, esoteric practice, all of it? What is Kabbalah?
All of it. For example, it's philosophy insofar it's the metaphysics of reality, according to Jewish thinking. It's cosmology because it provides a blueprint for the creation. It has esoteric, practical aspects, as I mentioned. This is the prophetic Kabbalah, where there is this attempt to manipulate reality. And it's also theosophical because it gives knowledge about God and his handiworks. So really, it's all of the above that you had mentioned.
All right. Then you're going to share with us some slides to dive a little bit deeper into it.
So it's a pleasure for me to share with you my interests in Kabbalistic Panpsychism, even though the focus is on panpsychism and consciousness, I'm hoping that in the course of this talk, general audiences will appreciate many of the concepts that build the knowledge of Kabbalah, which they can then think about and even apply to many, many areas of thought, not just related to consciousness. So to define what the Kabbalah is, it derives from the Hebrew term Kabbalah, which is from the root kabal, which means to receive. There are two aspects of the Torah, of Jewish law. There is the revealed Torah, which is the 5 books of Moses, the prophets, the writings, and the Talmud, which was passed on from Moses, who received it apparently from God on Mount Sinai, and he passed it on to the nation of Israel as a whole. Everybody had to become somewhat proficient in the laws of the revealed Torah. But at the same time, Moses received from God an esoteric aspect of the Torah, which is the Kabbalah. And this was transmitted to very select individuals, from mentor to apprentice, and the apprentice then mentored his apprentices. And this was largely passed on through all the ages, but largely below the radar of general Torah scholarship. Except there have been some periods where Kabbalistic insights sort of permeated the mainstream. For example, in the 2nd century with the writings of Rab Shimon Bar Yochai, during the 16th century in Israel, in the city of Safed, where there was the mystical movement of Kabbalah was burgeoning. There was another growth of Kabbalistic thinking with the rise of Hasidism in the 18th century. And it's anticipated that as we encroach on what's called the 7th millennium, the Messianic millennium, which is going to happen within the next roughly 220 odd years, there will be a tremendous outpouring of Kabbalistic truths. What this slide is trying to illustrate is that if you look at the revealed Torah, represented by this tree here on the left, it has very, very little to do with the sciences such as Newtonian physics. They're like two different worlds. There's the religious world, theological, and then there's the scientific world. But if you look at the underpinning of the revealed Torah, which is the esoteric Torah, the Kabbalah, and if you look at 20th century physics, specifically quantum mechanics and relativity, you begin to see a tremendous dialogue, the possibility of phenomenal conflation of ideas from the Kabbalah, the ancient Kabbalah, and the cutting edges of contemporary physics. That, to me, is a phenomenal development which allows, I think, for more people to understand the Kabbalah, because we now have examples from the physical sciences to help conceptualize the otherwise esoteric Kabbalistic doctrines. Before we move into the specifics of the Kabbalah, I would like to first couch the view of theology from the perspective of Judaism, but I think this is also true for Christianity and probably Islam as well. On the left here is one possibility where God creates the universe, but then he lets the universe run on its own devices. And this is referred to as theism. If God actually leaves the scene entirely, that would be deism. And this is not a Jewish perspective. In the middle is the concept of pantheism, which suggests that God is the universe. And if you understood the cosmos in all of its details, you would know God fully. And this view that God is purely immanent within the creation is pretty much anathema to Jewish thinking. The more authentic view is shown here on the right, and this is referred to as panentheism, and it advocates that God is both within the universe, as in pantheism, but is also transcendent of his creation, as in theism. This is the legitimate view of, at least from a Kabbalistic and Jewish perspective, of theology. One of the basic fundamental principles of the Kabbalah is that the entire creation and everything in it is coded for or based on what are called sephirot. And there are 10 of them, a singular sephirah and plural sephirot. And what a sephirah is, it can be defined as a divine force or an energy, a power, an attribute, or even an information packet. And there is the flow of divine knowledge or divine influence that begins with the absolutely infinite light of God, called the Ein Sof, the light of the Ein Sof, which just means infinite in Hebrew. And this passes to the first sephirah on the top, which is the crown, called Keter in Hebrew, crown. And then it passes in sequence from Keter to Chochmah to Bina to Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and finally the Sephirah of Malchut, which means kingship. Malchut, which is the divine feminine, acts as a transducer, which converts all of this influence into a product. And the product could be physical or it could be spiritual. It's important to understand that each Sephirah is made of both light and a vessel that contains the light. And it is the vessel that confers to the light, which is otherwise undifferentiated. The vessel gives the light, it gives it color, it gives it shape, and it gives it texture. And as an analogy, which one of the rabbis who is, I consider one of my mentors, Rabbi Ephraim Goldstein, who lives in Safat in Israel, he gives the analogy, if you want to understand the relationship of light to vessel, as think of a mug or a cup made out of ice that holds water. Both the water and the cup are the same material, H2O. The water, of course, is at a higher level of energy. In fact, you need to add energy to ice to melt it to make water. But the water itself is undifferentiated. It's formless. It's the cup made out of ice that gives shape and color to the water.
Hyman, but I think the Sephiroths came as a revelation. It wasn't really something that now we tried to make sense of it, all of us jointly, but originally it was a vision which came to someone or a group of people over time.
100%. Now, basically, this touches on, and this is a question I've been asked often when I give presentations of this kind. I've been asked, for example, none of what I've said on the Kabbalah is potentially falsifiable. You cannot falsify what I said. Hard to prove it too, but you cannot falsify it. And someone sort of complained that in order for something to move forward in science, it has to be potentially falsifiable. And I'm amazed to hear this comment, because nowhere in my presentation did I suggest at all that the Kabbalah is a science. It's not a science and does not have to fulfill the criteria of potential falsifiability. All of this knowledge came through revelation, not experimentation. And that's where belief has to come. We have to believe that some individuals, perhaps a lot greater than us, in the past, were able to receive information which explained to people like Shimon Bar Yochai or Isaac Luria or the Ramchal or Teilhard de Chardin in Christianity what is really going on, where this comes through revelation, not through experimentation. And in fact, I enjoy countering this question about falsifiability in the following way. There is an enormous concern among scientists today about the anthropic principle, that there are at least 20 parameters of physics that are so fine-tuned that if they were off by 1/1,000,000th of a part, the universe as we understand it could not exist. Everybody agrees with that. That's the anthropic principle. But it makes a lot of scientists uncomfortable. Why? Because it suggests that all of this cosmos came out of some infinitely creative mind for it to be as fine-tuned as we see it to be. And that goes against many views in science that tries to expunge a deity, God, spirituality, religion from science, which is why I've said in my writing that it's like the soul has been expunged from science. But what is puzzling to me is these same scientists that scream about falsifiability, they need something to replace the possibility of a all-knowing mind fine-tuning the universe. So they came up with a concept called the multiverse, that there are an infinite number of universes, and if there are an infinite number of such universes, it's not surprising that we find ourselves in the one that we could, that we are conscious of. The problem is the concept of the multiverse, which is spreading quite freely in scientific circles, also cannot be falsified. So is it science, or is it just another type of religion? That's the question I counter the so-called falsifiability question with. This slide is fundamental, and it is basically the Kabbalistic cosmology, the creation, pre-Genesis 1:1. And I put pre here in quotation marks because before the creation as it's spelled out in Genesis, there is no time or space. We will be talking as if there is time and space, because otherwise it would be impossible for me to convey to you the information that is in this slide. We start with panel A, and in panel A, all you have is the undifferentiated light of God, or the Ein Sof, the infinite light of the deity. Then God decides he wants to create a cosmos. He does so by a process in Hebrew called tzimtzum, which means contraction. He contracts from one point light away from that point, as shown here in panel B in black. Into this void, which will eventually contain the entire creation, he leaves a thin veneer of holiness, which is referred to as the Reshimu in Hebrew, as shown here in red. In panel D, what you see is the transcendent light of God surrounding the void, but then God sends a ray of light from the transcendent domain into the void. That's the immanent aspect of God entering into the void to combine with this Reshimu. So you can see from panel D why the Kabbalah, Judaism, is regarded as panentheism, because there's an aspect of God outside the creation as well as immanent within the creation itself.
But sorry, I was wondering, why did God transcend in the first place? Why was this creative urge or drive? Is there an answer to that in Kabbalah?
Well, from this slide itself, you could see that the transcendent aspect preceded the immanent aspect. It's not that God decided to transcend the creation. The transcendence comes first, even though first, again, is in quotation marks, there is no time. Things are happening outside of time here, which is a little difficult to comprehend. But the transcendent aspect preceded the immanent aspect, as shown in this sequence from A, B, C, and D.
Sorry, I know that there are so many versions of Kabbalah, and there was a book once I read, so I was wondering about your opinion about this. Because I was searching for this answer to the question why there is something rather than nothing. So, and one of the answers which was satisfactory to me internally, because we can't prove, we can't test it, right? Was I found it in one of the Kabbalah versions, and the answer was that God, which contained everything, all the polarities, all the potentialities, everything being outside of space and time, having its internal or inner nature of pure love, had so much love, but God was just one. It needed somebody else to love. And that basically sparked this process of division or withdrawal first, which then created another. And then from there, the whole sequence went and we ended up with the universe.
That is...
Do you agree with that? Is it something that you heard or...
That is absolutely correct. That is, if one were to ask the question, why did God create a universe? The Kabbalah intimates that the reason is for what you just enunciated, that basically God is loving kindness, and God wanted a recipient of this beneficence, wanted something to receive the love, because what good is love if you can't share it? So, yes.
Confirmed. Thank you.
Yeah. So once this ray of light, called Kav in Hebrew, combined with this Rishimu, this coating of holiness within the void, this gave birth, as it were, to the 10 Sephirot that I mentioned in an earlier slide. But the initial arrangement was that of concentric circles with Keter, which means crown, on the most sublime, at the interface between the immanence and the transcendent domains. And then Chochmah, Bina, and all the way down to the center here, which is again Malchut, the lowest of the 10 Sephirot, which is the divine feminine. But this is the arrangement of Sephirot which God uses to run the universe. The laws of the universe are built into this system. But in the relationship between the deity and humanity, there was a rearrangement of the Sephirot in what is called in Hebrew Tzurat Adam, the shape of man. And this is the familiar shape of the Sephirot that you will see in almost any literature you will look at, where you now don't have concentric circles, but you have a central trunk, you have a right side, and you have a left side, you have a top and a bottom, the shape of man. And this is the arrangement of the Sephirot which God uses concomitantly with concentric circles, but uses the shape of man to relate to man and to create the rest of the universe. And this is shown in this slide. So the very first world that was created in the shape of man, that I showed you in the previous slide, is called Adam Kadmon, which means primordial man, because the Sephirot are in the shape of what will eventually become man down the line. And it's shown over here. Now, it's important to understand that this tzimtzum, this contraction that led to the creation of the first world, is an iterative process. It continues over and over again and is still going on. The creation it occurs in real time. It's not a one-time deal and then God leaves. No, the it is a continuum. So the Tzimtzum happened again within this primordial man that gave rise to the next world, a lower world. And that world is called Atzilut, or the world of emanation, still a very sublime world, where there's great degree of unification of godliness in the world of Atzilut. And this happened again to create the world called creation, Bria, and then formation, another world, and then finally, the lowest world, the world of Asiya, the world of action. It's interesting to note that it's only from the Malchut, the very bottom of the world of action, that the physical universe came into existence. Everything I'm mentioning on this slide above that point, certainly these worlds, formation, creation, these are all creations, but they're all spiritual. They have absolutely no physicality. And the more you move to the right, the more you move towards Adam Kadmon, the more unified the creation is. And vice versa, the more you move towards Asiya, the more there is divisiveness and separation.
How should we see this? How should we see this? Is it like layers upon layers, or as the stages of creation, or both?
Both. And you can look at it as layers upon layers. That's what I'm trying to show with these square brackets. Exactly that. That the world of emanation, for example, wraps around the bottom half, let's say, of Adam Kadmon, primordial man. The world of creation wraps around emanation, etc., etc. So you could look at it as worlds. The Torah calls them worlds, but it may be more proper to view them as dimensions. Dimensions. With Asiya being the most superficial of the dimensions. Another way to look at it, and I think it's a very useful way, is to understand this system in the context of the physics of the 20th century physicist David Bohm. In Bohmian mechanics, he looks at the universe as layer and layer of implicate orders, each one on top of the one deep to it, until finally you get the world that we experience, which is the explicate order. This system that I'm describing here of worlds in Kabbalah is similar to Bohmian mechanics. And I'll show you more about that in a couple of slides. One way to understand the relationship between what's happening in a higher world and a lower world is what the Kabbalah refers to as the signet ring metaphor. Let me take you through this metaphor. It'll give you, I think, some understanding of how the worlds relate to each other. You could, for example, have a signet ring that has a very beautiful face of a tiger, highly sophisticated image of a tiger, and you add ink to it and you apply it to a first piece of paper, and lo and behold, you have a wonderful replica of the face of this tiger. Let's call that the way the tiger would appear. Of course, it's all metaphor now. There are no tigers up there, but in the world of creation, a pretty high world of Bria creation. Now, when this image is still wet, take the paper, the wet image, and apply it to a second piece of paper. And this will generate for you a second generation image. You can probably still make out that it is a tiger, but the image is very washed out and degraded relative to the way the tiger looks so beautifully integrated in the higher world of Bria. In the lower world below Bria, which is Yetzirah, formation, you still have a tiger, but now there's much more divisiveness in your picture. Now, when the paper representing the second generation image is still moist, apply it now to a third piece of paper. And now what you see is a highly distorted image, a great degree of separation. You can probably not even make out that it's a tiger anymore. And this is the world that we live in. We live in a tremendous world of separation. I'm separate from other people. My desk is separate from my bottle of mineral water. Different ethnic groups separate from each other culturally. But if you were to be able to look deeper into higher worlds or into Bohm's implicate order, you would start to see the connection between the entire creation.
But when we say that we are made in the image of God, I don't know if Kabbalah says that, but in Christianity certainly it exists in the microcosm and the macrocosm. But are we so distorted, or is it just to illustrate the the principle? Because it basically says that if we are in the image of God, we are in a way. Well, I cannot say I'm God, but yes, I am made in the image of God. So therefore, I am. My property should be as perfect, perfectly reflective God.
Right. So Judaism, just like Christianity, accepts the principle of imago Dei, that we're made in God's image, and that's why the very first world that was created is called primordial man, because there is a relationship. It's not a physical relationship, but there is a spiritual relationship. And there is the notion, which is, the Hebrew term is mipsarai achazel loka, from my flesh I will know God. God specifically made us in his image so that we can learn about him by understanding ourselves. That's the purpose of making us in his image. So we can sort of trace our way back all the way, each to his own capacity of imagination, back to the deity. And that's why we're made in his image. And this, what I wanted to also show in this slide, is that although the tiger looks very different in the different worlds, there is a mathematical one-to-one point connection between every part of the image up in this world of creation to the world of formation, down to the world of action. You could not have made this distorted image unless the tiger looked the way it did up in the higher image. Do you follow what I'm saying? In other words, if, let's say, this tiger, metaphorically, were to blink in the world of creation, this would reverberate through all the worlds down into the world of action. There's a one-to-one correspondence mathematically, even though it gets distorted. But if, for example, a blinking tiger in the world of creation may manifest as a hurricane in our world. And that's how you're supposed to understand the layering of worlds.
So the worlds are interlinked still, and they are connected. So whatever happens
Absolutely.
in one world will have an implication in other worlds. As if
that is absolutely correct. Yes. Another way to look at the relationship is this inverted telescope metaphor. So you have at the top, of course, top, bottom, right, left. These are all metaphors because there is no up and down in spiritual reality. But the top is the what's called the Ein Sof, which is the undivided unity of God. And then he creates a world after world, finally reaching the bottom world where we're in, the world of action. So this inverted telescope could be representing the worlds. Let's say the top one is primordial man, and then you have the world of emanation and the world of creation, formation, and action. We're down here. We're pretty far away from the undifferentiated light of God. But we overlap. Each world, as I mentioned in the previous slide, sort of overlaps the world above it. And it's at the joints of the telescope where divine influence, beneficence, goodness, can flow from a higher world into a lower world until it reaches us down here. Now, when the world is not in good shape, in other words, there's a lot of strife, a lot of evil, what happens, metaphorically, is this telescope gets stretched so that we're down here now, we're spiritually at much greater distance from the Ein Sof than we were before. In addition, when you stretch the telescope, there's now less overlap between worlds at the joints. So less goodness can flow from Ein Sof into the lower realms. In contrast, when we do the right thing, which by the Torah, it's following the 613 mitzvot, the laws of the Torah, when we follow these laws and live moral, ethical lives, what we're doing is we are retracting the telescope back towards its source. Now, if we're here at the bottom of the world of action, we're much closer to the indivisible light of God than we were, let's say, a year ago. And there's much more overlap, much more overlap between the worlds, as shown in this slide. And therefore, tremendous goodness can flow. I'm going to now turn to another concept, which is vital, I think, in understanding the way the cosmos is designed, Kabbalistically speaking. And that is the notion of interinclusion, or hitkalalut in Hebrew. Interinclusion is the notion that the entire whole, the entire cosmos, is recapitulated in every part of the cosmos. The Kabbalah refers to it as the ability to see within each sephirah, let's say crown, keter. If you were to look inside the sephirah, like put it under a microscope, what you would see inside it are 10 mini sephirot. And if you look in one of the mini sephirot and you magnify it, you will see 10 mini sephirot ad infinitum. And this is basically a holographic design of the cosmos, or a fractal design, which the Kabbalah has been promulgating for centuries now. And it's only in the 20th century that we have some inkling of what a hologram is. It was discovered by Dennis Gabor in the middle of the 20th century. And it illustrates beautifully what this concept of interinclusion is. I'll take you through this because it's really a remarkable reality. And that is, if you were to take a photograph, a regular photograph of, let's say, the globe, and you would take the photograph and you cut out the upper right segment of the globe, and you look at it, what you would see in this analogy is perhaps Siberia. You certainly would not see the whole globe. You've cut a piece out of it. But if you were to make a holographic plate and you cut out the right upper segment and you shine a laser through it, what you would see is not Siberia. You would see the entire globe, albeit in miniature. And that is because, according to the laws of quantum mechanics, all of reality, all of the cosmos is built through light, is recapitulated in each point of light. And that's why you could see an entire globe within one tiny little segment of your holographic plate. And this is the principle that the Kabbalah has been trying to explain for centuries of interinclusion. Interinclusion, or a holographic universe, was made famous by David Bohm, who I alluded to in an earlier slide, the physicist, whose mathematics and physics came to the conclusion that the design of the universe is probably holographic. And there is now more evidence for this. Since Bohm's death in 1992, there has been now accruing evidence that this could well possibly be true. And I'm not, unless you have questions, I'm not going to go into the physical evidence for this. But if you read Bohm, it's remarkable, because what he refers to as the hollow movement, which is the indivisible wholeness of nature, that is very similar to what the Kabbalah refers to as the light of the Ein Sof, the Or Ein Sof. When Bohm talks about layer of implicate order finally leading to an explicate order, that is the idea of enclothement that I showed you in a previous slide. And when he talks about a holographic universe, that's interinclusion. I don't see any difference between Bohmian mechanics and the ancient Kabbalah with respect to these principles. And everywhere you look in the world, you'll now see examples of fractals and holograms everywhere. For example, the mathematics of Benoit Mandelbrot, the famous fractal geometry of the Mandelbrot set, where if you magnify this image I'm showing you here 1,000,000 times, you'll still see a tiny version of this image showing up at every magnification. You see evidence of fractal geometry in the branches of trees, in the fronds of a fern, in the chambers of a nautilus, in the tributaries of rivers seen in satellite images, in the airways of the lungs, in the vascularization of the heart. Everywhere you look, you will see this interinclusion principle. The most startling example of this is shown in this slide, which this idea was published in 2017. On the right is what's called the cosmic web. What this image is it's the largest image ever photographed. Each point of light, these little white or little blue specks of light, is a galaxy made up of roughly 100 billion stars. And these galaxies form filaments that meander through the cosmos, as shown here on the right. When you look at the synaptic interconnectivity of the human brain and you analyze it mathematically, the math looks extremely similar to the shape, the mathematical shape of the cosmic web. To me, this is an example of interinclusion to an extreme degree. And one can speculate that just as the synaptic connectivity of the human brain gives rise to human consciousness, perhaps the meandering of the cosmic web has something to do with a more grand form of consciousness. But of course, this is just conjecture on my part. And if you're interested, you can also, if you're artistically inclined, which I'm not particularly, but if you are, you can see interinclusion, hitkallalut, in the works of of Jackson Pollock. In these three examples of his art, you'd be very hard pressed to know whether you're looking at something the size 1 millimeter square or 50 meters square because of this fractal design. The next concept that I'd like to share with you is even more bewildering than the interinclusion, and it's called interpenetration. Basically, I had shown you that if you look at a world, everything, the whole world or every part of it, is made up of these 10 sephirot. So if you look at the world of creation, it's made of 10 sephirot. The light of God enters into the world at the highest level, which is the sephirah of Keter, crown, and it moves in a hierarchy all the way down to Malchut, the bottom, and then Malchut of the higher world feeds into the Keter of the next world, etc., until you reach the very bottom of Asiya that gives rise to a physical universe. This is the typical, conventional, hierarchical way that we understand the creation. But at the very same time, there is a cross-cutting mode, illustrated here in gray, where God can decide to activate, let's say, the Sephirah of Chesed, loving kindness, throughout the entire fractal infrastructure of the cosmos. So Chesed, loving kindness, can light up in all worlds and in every part of each world concomitantly. This is a much greater manifestation of integration than the hierarchical mode. But both of these modes occur concomitantly. It's more a shift of consciousness when you go from one understanding to the more cross-cutting mode, from the hierarchical to the cross-cutting mode. There is no absolute change in the underlying metaphysics. It's a shift of consciousness.
But to me, this looks. I'm sorry. To me, this looks like or resembles a little bit the cosmology of Neoplatonists, right? Am I correct? Because there you also have a layer from the one, and then there are emanations of several layers going downward, so to speak, towards creation, towards our world, the universe. It's just that here it's more detailed and there is a relationship clearly between different Sephiroth shown. But that's the cosmology, isn't it, of Kabbalah?
Well, there is a connection with Platonism, Neoplatonism, because when you go into Plato's most sublime realm, you have perfection. And we don't see perfection down here, but this low world is connected eventually up to levels of absolute and perfected forms, for example, that Plato described. So yes, there is some link to Neoplatonism. But what I find even more remarkable is the link between what I showed you here with interpenetration and the concept of quantum entanglement, shown on the right, for which the Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded in 2022. This is astounding. What quantum entanglement is telling us is that if you have a progenitor particle and it splits into two particles, let's say two photons. Photons have, by the rules of quantum mechanics, an attribute called spin. And spin can be either spin up or spin down. If particle A is spin up, then its sister particle has to be spin down. It's just a law of quantum physics. What's interesting and remarkable is if these two particles separate from each other halfway across the universe, and if you can manipulate particle A and switch it from spin up to spin down, the sister particle B will automatically, simultaneously switch from spin down to spin up. Immediately, even if these particles are separated by half a universe. This concept was very bothersome to Albert Einstein because it totally suggests that information is traveling from A to B at supraluminal speeds in defiance of the special theory of relativity. He couldn't stomach it. But we now know that Einstein was incorrect, and a more legitimate interpretation of what's happening came from the work of other physicists, such as David Bohm, who indicated that because these two particles originate in a single particle, outside of time, in the implicate order, these two particles are really part and parcel of the same thing. So when particle A in the explicate order, the order we can experience with our senses and with our instruments, switches from spin up to down, and then you see an immediate reciprocal event in particle B, it does not require any information traveling from A to B because both particles in the implicate order are really part and parcel of the same thing. To me, this quantum entanglement is exactly the idea that the Kabbalah is trying to portray with the cross-cutting mode where one sephirah, let's say the one I gave you, loving kindness, is turned on immediately throughout every aspect of the creation.
It's what Einstein called spooky action at a distance or something like that, right?
And he used it as a derogatory term. And now, of course, we know that this is true. And there's evidence for this, which is remarkable. Let me show you an example, just a metaphor again, for how to view the idea that in an implicate order, things could be connected in ways they aren't to our senses. In the middle of the 20th century, with the advent of the electron microscope, we were able to look at cells at tremendous magnification. So here, for example, is a cell that's magnified, let's say, 100,000 times. And what you see here are these bags of membrane, and this is what's called the endoplasmic reticulum. It's an organelle or organelles within the cytoplasm of a cell that makes proteins. That's where proteins are made. When you look in this two-dimensional electron micrograph, you might think that there are multiple organelles called endoplasmic reticulum in the cytoplasm. One over here, one down here, another one here. Maybe each one makes its own protein. We know that that's incorrect. Several decades after the advent of the two-dimensional EM, we were able to now reconstruct this image in 3 dimensions. And when you do that, what you see is that the endoplasmic reticulum is really one single unified organelle within the cytoplasm, which only appears as individual stacks of membrane in a two-dimensional image. So we tend to see things like the 2D image of separation, but we have to understand that in deeper realms, higher worlds, or in Bohm's implicate order, there's much greater integration. This slide, I'm not going to belabor it, but I do want to make 1 or 2 points. I showed you these inverted telescopes, and when the world was created, God went from absolute unification to a stretching out of part of his being, as it were, where now Malchut, the bottom, is separate from Keter. There's now a hierarchy. And when you're looking at the hierarchy from top down, this is referred to in Hebrew as orech, which just means verticality. It's the vertical perspective, the hierarchical perspective. We tend to look at the world through these eyes. But there is also the contraction back, as I mentioned before, of the telescope, where there's much, much greater unity through the processes of this interpenetration I showed you in the previous slide. And this is referred to in Hebrew as oivi, which just means horizontality. And I just want to make the point again that there is no shift in the underlying metaphysics when God rules the world through from the perspective of Orech and Oivi. Both are occurring concomitantly. It's just a shift in our consciousness where we're used to Orech, but we should understand that beneath the surface there is horizontality or tremendous interpenetration of the cosmos.
But just a question, if you go back to that slide, but from my understanding, then in Kabbalah, there is no, so the good and evil, those are polarities, but evil or darkness is not something which exists independently. It's not an independent polarity, it's just a matter of lack of light or distance from light, right? Is that the correct
understanding?
Absolutely
correct. And I think this is one area where Judaism and Christianity may differ a little bit. If I'm not mistaken, in Christianity, Satan has somewhat more independence than the idea of Satan, which means Satan in Hebrew, in Judaism. For the reason you mentioned, God created the darkness. Satan or Satan is an instrument in God's hands that he needs for this world to be the way it is. You can ask why, and the answer is probably it's a question that's been asked. That's theodicy. Why is there evil in the world? I'm not going to try to address this in my remaining time in this interview, but I will just say that if there wasn't the potential for evil, good would have no meaning. And I'll let the audience think about why that is. You need darkness in order to perceive light. In the next slide, now that you're familiar with these concepts of interinclusion, enclothement, interpenetration, I'm going to now take you through a metaphor of how God runs the universe, how he creates things, how he makes things happen. And it's all based on these 10 Sephiroth. And it begins like this. And the metaphor I'm going to employ is that of a woman who has a desire to build and live in a house. And this is, the woman is God here, and the house is the universe. God desires the universe. Desire shows up in the Sephirah, the top one of Keter, or crown. Once that desire comes out of nowhere, all of a sudden, an undifferentiated image pops into her mind as to what kind of house she wants. Let's say a cottage. The whole cottage appears in her mind as a unity, and that is the next Sephirah after Keter, which is Chokhmah, which means wisdom. Everything is in there, but it's in a single point. It's totally undifferentiated. It's a singularity. Then, in order for her to eventually get her house, she takes that image of a cottage, and she then hires an architect to develop architectural plans, which now have to include the design of the house, the dimensions of the cottage, the materials she wants to use. This is the drop from the unity of Chokhmah into Bina, which is the next Sephirah, which is understanding. Now it's starting to flesh out what this house will be composed of. These Sephirot, Keter, Chokhmah, Bina, crown, wisdom, and understanding, are the conscious Sephirot of every decasephirotic system. The top 3 are conscious, the bottom 7 are unconscious. And since everything is made up of 10 Sephirot, everything has to have some sort of consciousness, and that's why you can refer to the Kabbalah as panpsychist in its ontology. Panpsychism being the notion that everything has some sort of consciousness in it, whether it's a molecule or a lizard or a human being. This slide again shows you where Keter plays its role. It's different than the other Sephirot. The other 9 can be considered within the plane of section, or within whatever system you're studying or perceiving, finally reaching Malchut. Whatever system you're looking at, Keter is one of the 10 Sephirot, but it's outside your system. It's, going back to one of the earliest slides, it's like the interface between transcendence of God and the immanence of God, where the lower 9 would be immanent and Keter is almost transcendent, is transcendent. So that's why I show Keter influencing the system coming out through a wormhole, like as if it's coming from somewhere else. Keter does talk to Chokhmah, and Chokhmah to Bina, like I showed you the hierarchy. But what this slide illustrates, and this is pretty important, is that there's a unique linkage between the highest Sephirah, Keter, and Malchut, the divine feminine. Since I mentioned Malchut creates the final product, Malchut gets a choice of products, as I'll show you in one of the last slides, but this choice has to conform with the will of God. This is an axis called the Keter Malchut, or crown king axis. You're sort of crowning the king, but the king is, in Kabbalah, the divine feminine. So after Keter, there are the other 2 Sephirot of consciousness, Chokhmah on the right and Bina on the left. And the way to understand Chokhmah and Bina, Chokhmah is wisdom. Think of it, as I already mentioned, as a cosmologic singularity. In human beings, since we're made in the image of God, it's the way the right hemisphere works, looking at a gestalt. This is, if you're familiar with the incredible writings of Ian McGilchrist, it's McGilchrist's master. It's the eureka moment. Woo, I want a cottage. It has a transcendent quality because it talks to Keter, which is outside your system. It's pretty friendly to paradox. It can hold paradox. It's represented by the sense of vision, which gets the whole picture. And it's pretty much the way Eastern philosophies, Hinduism, Buddhism, unfold. Bina, which is understanding, this is no longer a cosmologic singularity. This is the Big Bang aftermath. Now there's separation. This is the way the left hemisphere works. Ian McGilchrist's emissary. Now there's differentiation. A single thought gets broken into language so I can convey it. It's hearing more than vision. It's intolerant of paradox. And it's the way Western philosophy and the way Western science works. So we've dealt with the conscious Sephirot, but we still don't have a house. The lady wants a house. She doesn't just want architectural plans. So she hires a construction company. And the construction company is made up of the next 6 Sephirot working in unison. Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, doesn't matter what these terms really mean, but they work together to physically build the house. This is the body, no longer the consciousness. And when the final nail is hammered into the house to complete the house, this is the work of the divine feminine. This is the work of Malchut. And now the woman can live in the house, and this house satiates her initial desire, which was in the transcendent Sephirah of Keter. And this establishes this Keter Malchut axis that I showed you in a previous slide, and it's recapitulated here, which will become very important in the next slide or two. She has her house. She built it, and it conforms to her desire. But now she says, wait a minute, now I want to work on the living room. It starts the whole process again, like a fractal. She then decides on what kind of living room, that she wants a living room, is in a mini Keter, which then activates 9 mini Sephirot in order to make a living room according to her specifications. So this and other sub-Keters are nested hierarchically or in parallel within the overarching will, the Keter prime, to own eventually a house according to her desire.
I was wondering though, you're saying that the Keter, so the top Sephirah, the divine will, directly informs Malkut, which is the bottom, right? And the phenomenal world. And in order to ensure that the divine will is done, so to ensure that God's will is done in our world, is there free will according to Kabbalah or not?
Yeah, so I will address the free will conundrum in detail in a final slide, and hopefully will answer your question. It's important to understand that, and this is where Lurianic Kabbalah comes in. It's a contribution of Isaac Luria to the Kabbalah in the 1500s, 1600s. And that is the idea of Shvirat HaKelim, in Hebrew, shattering of the vessels. When God created the world of emanation from the world of Adam Kadmon, or primordial man, he put certain spiritual deficiencies into the creation, which allows for evil, etc. But what it caused was the initial construction of the world of emanation shattered. But only the 7 lower Sephirot, the bodily Sephirot, broke. The 3 top Sephirot there was a distortion, there was a warping of the Sephirot, but they did not shatter. Why I think this is interesting is because every body of a decasephirotic system, let's say a human being, is made up of many parts. I have a heart, I have a liver, I have a spleen, I have an appendix. Whereas consciousness, because the 3 top Sephirot never shattered, there's only one consciousness to a customer. No matter how simple the consciousness or how complex, you don't have 3 consciousness unless you have some psychiatric disease. But we're talking about normalcy. And normally there's only one experience of consciousness. And I'm conjecturing that it's because the conscious Sephirot in the original blueprint of creation never shattered. So to review, I told you that there are 3 conscious Sephirot, and there are 7 lower unconscious Sephirot in everything. Hence panpsychism. The arrangement is hierarchical, it's holographic, and I'm also going to suggest that it's relativistic in an Einsteinian sense. The Kabbalah, the Torah, separates all of reality into 4 domains. An inanimate domain, where there is consciousness, because it has 3 top sephirot, but here consciousness simply informs the form of a mineral, let's say, or the type of mineral it is, the substance of the mineral, is informed by that consciousness. Next level up is plant life. Now you have consciousness informing growth and reproduction, which was denied to the inanimate class. Moving up, you have animal life, where now consciousness allows for sentience, emotions, psychological reality. And then finally, in Hebrew, medaber, which means speaker, referring to human beings, where consciousness reaches its pinnacle, where there's self-awareness, rationality, morality, ethics, etc. Now, this is the pivotal slide in trying to understand Kabbalistic Panpsychism. And what is shown in this square here is consciousness space, given as white. White is consciousness space. On the left is transcendent consciousness. On the right is immanent consciousness, perfectly in keeping with the panentheistic structure of the Kabbalah. Panentheism. God has an immanent and a transcendent phase. If you look at the inanimate class, a mineral, like everything else, it's made of 10 sephirot. The top 3, GR here in red, GR just means in Hebrew top 3, that's all it means. The top 3 sephirot act as a filter, which filters a minute amount of consciousness out of the transcendent phase into the immanent phase, just enough to give the rock form. When you move to the next level, plant life, there's also 3 top conscious sephirot, but now they're able to filter from the transcendent phase more consciousness, allowing for growth and reproduction. Now, the reason why I say this is relativistic is the following. We know that plants have minerals in them, just like the mineral above. But when a mineral is incorporated into a plant, the 10 sephirot of the mineral are compactified within the 7 lower unconscious bodily sephirot of the plant, as the plant now expresses its higher level of consciousness, because of what I mentioned in the previous slide, that there's only one consciousness to a system or to a customer. In other words, the plant does not express the consciousness of growth, reproduction, and each of the tremendous number of minerals that are incorporated into the plant. The same thing happens when you upgrade from plant to animal life. The animal is made of 10 sephirot, like everything else. The bottom 7 are unconscious, top 3 allow for filtration of a much higher level of consciousness than a plant. But the animal does have the capacity for growth and reproduction, plant-like attributes, but the 10 sephirot of the plant are now compactified into 7 lower sephirot of the animal. And the same thing happens as you move from animal into man. We obviously have animalistic traits, animalistic attributes, but they're within our suppressed unconsciousness, where we can express much higher level of consciousness, rationality, ethics, morality. And as I alluded to in an earlier slide, this level of expression, this filtration through our top sephirot, is going to expand enormously as we enter into the messianic millennium, which is due to happen within the next 220 odd years.
I was wondering if we just, about the previous slide, in panpsychism, are we talking about some sort of a divine spark which is permeating every form of life, starting from mineral downwards? Oh, upwards rather.
Yeah, the term spark is used in the Kabbalah in 2 different ways. One way is what you just alluded to, that everything has a spark of the divine in it, or else it couldn't exist. And if you went to the most implicate order, in other words, all the way up to primordial man and beyond, you would see the Ein Sof, the infinite light of God, in a pebble, in a stone, in a plant, and certainly in a human beings. That's one way that spark is used in Kabbalah. The other way spark is commonly used is when the vessels shattered in the shattering of the lower seven, little sparks of divinity got encapsulated by what are called in Hebrew klipot, which are shells that cover this light. It separates, it's almost like a separation of God, which is only true from our point of view, the Orich perspective, see separation. If you can look from God's perspective of Oivi, you would see there really is no separation. You have to be able to paradoxically hold that in mind. But our job as human beings down here in the world of action is to search out those little sparks by doing good deeds and combining it with the Ein Sof to complete the name of God, as it will. Even though God never changed, he's always unified. It's only from our perspective, from down looking up, that we see disunity. And that's the paradox that the right hemisphere is better at holding than the left hemisphere. Now, this slide, I love showing it. And I think it addresses your question about free will. And it has to do with a structure called, in Aramaic actually, Reisha de lo Isyada, the Unknowable Head. And it's a structure within the sphera of Keter, crown. And it works like this. And as I explain it, you'll see that it has a lot of similarity to the Heisenberg uncertainty principle of quantum mechanics, the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. Let me illustrate this for you. God decides he wants something, he wills something into existence. Let's call this something ABCD. What this Radla, this unknowable head, does is it scrambles the message into every permutation and combination of ABCD. ABCD, BACD, CABD, etc. There are 24 possibilities. And transmits these possibilities below this Radla into the universe through the 9 lower Sephirot, if you're looking at the whole universe as one decasephirotic system for simplicity's sake, until you reach Malchut, the divine feminine, which, as I mentioned before, is a transducer that converts the will into either an object or an event. When you look at what Malchut produced, lo and behold, you see ABCD. This is very similar to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, where before an observer looks at something, there is a superposition of states where many possible realities coexist in potentia, and only when you observe does it, what QM calls collapse of the wave function, collapses the superposition into one state that is observed. And when you look at it, you see something. Let's say ABCD. But here is where the Kabbalah and quantum physics, or Torah and science, if you will, part ways radically. And it has to do with this Keter Malchut axis. What this axis does is that when it transmits the message to Malchut, in the case of quantum mechanics, where the Keter Malchut axis has not yet been realized by science, the product could just as easily have been CABD, BACD, any of these possibilities. In other words, in the famous metaphor, Schrodinger's cat could be either alive or dead with pretty much equal probability. Not so, says the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah insists that when you observe what Malchut produced, It can only be A, B, C, D, because this was imposed on Malchut by this Keter Malchut axis I showed you in a previous slide. The reason we have a Radla, why God made this Radla, is so that we cannot directly intuit the will of God. This creates a veil for us. The Radla is like a veil, which allows us to operate below this Radla as if the universe has no determinate nature, that there is randomness in the universe as understood by Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. If we could see beyond the Radla, we would see that everything is really preordained. So is there free will or is there no free will? It depends on which perspective you wish to take. If you look at the way we operate below the Radla, God made it so that we have free will in every meaningful way of understanding free will. And we agonize over our decisions. And when someone drops his wallet and you pick it up, you really have to decide, am I going to keep it or am I going to give it back? Even though God knows what you're going to do, you still are forced to make an ethical decision. That's the paradox of free will. We have it below the Radla, which is the universe created for us. But if you were able to pierce this Radla membrane, you would see you don't. And there have been individuals who can pierce the membrane. That's what prophecy is. A prophet is able to pierce the Radla and be able to intuit directly the will of God. But it comes at a price. If you know the story of the king of the Moabites, Balak, and Balaam, the prophet, Balak hired Balaam to curse the Jews. And Balaam said, sure, for a price, I'll do it. But he warned Balak that as soon as he starts to prophesy, he can only speak out the words that God puts into his mouth because he has pierced the Radla and all semblance of free will dissipates. And because of the Keter Malchut axis, he was forced to praise the Jews, as the Old Testament explains it, instead of cursing it. This is this concept of free will as seen through Kabbalah. It's not a simple concept, and you have to be able to toggle from below the Radla, which is the Orich perspective, to the Oivi perspective, which is sort of above the Radla.
But then, I think we cannot say that we have free will. If that model is true and is correct, then what we have an illusion of free will, illusion of free will, and a possibility to exercise sort of mentally possible options, right? So that means that there shouldn't be any karma, right? Is there a karma in the concept of karma in Kabbalah?
Part of the will of God is to endow us with free will. That's a paradox. But he gives us the ability through our prayers to influence what happens, even though the idea of what happens is a misnomer, because everything just is from God's perspective. Things just are. But he created us to live in a world of physicality, where free will is very meaningful to us. More so, and I had the discussion when I gave a similar presentation under the auspices of individuals of the Buddhist persuasion. We discussed whether or not Judaism or Kabbalah looks at the world as an illusion, as is true in some strains of Buddhism. For example, I think Advaita Vedanta and other disciplines where the world really is illusory in certain respects, but not so in the Kabbalah. God willed this world to be real. It's hard for us to understand that paradox. But so the only way to explain it is to look at each realm independently. God's view, no, there's no free will. Our view, there's free will in every meaningful human sense of the term, whether or not God knows what's going to happen. And you can influence God's will, because even though I showed you that there's a flow from Keter to Malchut, it's bidirectional. And through our prayers, through our good deeds, we influence what goes on above, even though this is only, again, true from an Orich perspective. In Oivi, nothing changes. God just is, and there is no past, present, or future. So you can't extrapolate from what we experience below this Rudla in an Orich form of consciousness to what happens in the Oivi way of looking at things. You just have to accept the paradox and move on. The paradoxes that I've been trying to describe in the Kabbalah and in physics are truly, I believe, ontic paradox, not epistemic paradox. What I mean by that is an epistemic paradox is only paradoxical because we have limited intellect, and were we just a little bit smarter, we may be able to, quote, resolve the paradox. That is how a lot of people understood paradox. The Kabbalah does not understand it this way. The Kabbalah sees paradox as ontic. It's built into the creation for it to be paradoxical. Like this example I tried to mention about the free will being both existent and non-existent depending on where your vantage point is. They're both true. It is a paradox, but it's an ontic paradox because God created it to be such. Now, for hundreds and hundreds of years, I can't imagine how scholars of the Kabbalah understood some of these ontic paradoxes or the idea of interinclusion or interpenetration. These are wildly imaginative concepts. But we now live in the last 120 years in a world where we were fortunate to get examples of these types of concepts from the sciences themselves. The same sciences that for millennia, Aristotelian thinking, etc., drew Jews and Christians and others away from their faith. The same sciences I believe, are supporting more than ever before a faith-based understanding of reality. And what I mean by that is the advent of quantum mechanics. The most important thing I think we learned from quantum mechanics is that light is both a particle and a wave. Now, you're going to ask me, well, which one really is it? Is it really a particulate or is it a wave? The answer is both. This is an ontic paradox. It's not epistemic. I think no matter how much we learn about light, we will still conclude that it's both a wave as well as a particle. We just have to get used to that. And it is the advent of such models coming out of science that allows a student of the Kabbalah to assimilate these otherwise highly esoteric concepts in a much more plausible fashion. In other words, as I mentioned, and getting back to what's a sephira is both light and a vessel, both made out of light. One is pure light, one is congealed light. It's like what the sciences are doing for us. They're preparing us to have intellectual vessels so that we can absorb and hold on to the light of the Kabbalah, which we didn't have 200 years ago or even 130 years ago. So this is what I would say about ontic versus epistemic paradox. We're now being more comfortable with the idea of ontic paradox because that's how God designed the world, according to the Kabbalah. In this slide, I can just summarize and say that all things created from a Kabbalistic perspective, whether they're the animate domain or inanimate, everything's made of 10 sephirot, of which the top 3 represent the construct's brains, mochen in Hebrew, and are the conveyors of consciousness. Consciousness, according to the Kabbalah, is not the product of, it's not secreted by, it's not emergent within, or the exclusive domain of neural tissue. It's not an epiphenomenon that's bereft of causal action within the material world. So this is in contradistinction to the prevailing scientific view of consciousness, which almost denies its existence in some circles, although that's changing. Consciousness, according to the Kabbalah, is primordial to, it transcends, it lends existence to, and is also immanent within and impacts every aspect of reality, both spiritual as well as physical. The idea of consciousness, it's based on some fundamental principles of Jewish mysticism, but as I try to explain, it's best understood in the context of modern quantum physics, neuroscience, and philosophy. It's clearly panpsychist in nature, because everything is made of or is coded by 10 sephirot, and the top 3 are its consciousness. It's informed deeply by the tenets of panentheism. It's arranged hierarchically and holographically. It has relativistic attributes, and in contradistinction to the prevailing scientific opinion, it is capable of downward causation. It totally does away, Kabbalistic Panpsychism completely does away with Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness. This was published by David Chalmers in 1995, 94, 95, where he raised the issue, how is it possible that the material world, no matter how sophisticated our electrical impulses in our temporal lobe or in our frontal lobe, how it can give rise to the experience of a symphony, or to the vision of a sunset, or to the taste of a strawberry. Yes, you can explain it by the neural correlates of consciousness, but nothing seems to bridge the gap between the physics and the subjective experience of consciousness, which he calls the hard problem. Well, this problem is non-existent from the Kabbalah, because consciousness is there as part of every decasephirotic system from the get-go. It also neutralizes the combination problem, which is a challenge to what's called constitutive panpsychism, which asks the question, how is it possible? Okay, panpsychism tells us that even atoms have some sort of consciousness, but how do the consciousnesses of atoms and molecules combine to form the highly elaborate consciousness of, say, an earthworm, a lizard, or a human being? How do you combine many consciousnesses into a more holistic, unified, elaborate consciousness? And this question is rendered moot by the Kabbalah, because we're starting from a universal, infinite mind of God, which in a top-down fashion, panentheistically, differentially reveals itself within the creation hierarchy. So this is not constitutive panpsychism, it's cosmopsychism. And the way the Kabbalah construes consciousness with the relationship of the immanent light to a transpersonal light is the idea of non-local properties of consciousness being entangled with the transcendent aspects, which, if true, would account for extrasensory perception, prophecy, near-death experiences, and other so-called psi phenomena or paranormal phenomena that have been documented in virtually every culture. This is the last concluding slide I'd like to share with you. And basically, it's a very optimistic view of where we're going with human consciousness, and it's taken right out of the Zohar. And I'll read it to you in translation from the Aramaic. In the 600th year of the 6th millennium, corresponding to 1840, the year 1840, for whatever reason, the upper gates of wisdom, the Kabbalah, will be opened, and also the well springs of wisdom below, which is secular scientific knowledge. This will prepare the world for the 7th millennium, like a person prepares himself on Friday for Shabbat as the sun begins to wane. So this was my last slide. If anybody's interested in reading more on this topic, I published a book in 2021 where I do conflate many ideas of the Kabbalah with quantum physics. I talk about female intuition and how that relates to the Kabbalah. I show some interesting parallels between Kabbalistic Panpsychism and neuroanatomy. I talk about the free will conundrum, and I end up with some speculation on the future of human consciousness.
Physics tells us that after original Big Bang, the universe, as it looks now, will continue to expand forever. And you say that according to Kabbalah, the creation process will also go on forever. Is it the same thing? But at the same time, there is also a point of Genesis in Kabbalah, right? So there is a correspondence between Big Bang and what physics tells us and what Kabbalah told us, or it differs somehow.
No, well, it is. I mean, there is a correlation. In fact, before the Big Bang Theory, for Gamow and Hubble and others, Penzias, it was people followed the Aristotelian viewpoint that the universe always existed, which was against the Torah, against the Old Testament. New Testament didn't accept that. There was a beginning according to our scriptures. And it's only in the 20th century that we pretty much discarded the Aristotelian view, and now we accept the Big Bang cosmology, which is remarkable also. How much, as I mentioned before, how much science is supportive of biblical narrative. But I don't think I said that the universe will continue forever. We're going through epochs. The first was a 6,000-year epoch that we're finishing now. And within about 220 years or so, we should be entering the Messianic millennium, where there will be a tremendous flux of light, transcendent light, moving into the immanent phase in our minds. We will grow tremendously intellectually, but more importantly, morally and ethically, because the Torah does not just look at the intellect as the pinnacle of human growth. In fact, it puts a lot more emphasis on ethics. And this influx of new light will, of course, inform the entire cosmos. So plants will be more animal-like. Animals may be more human-like. Rocks will be more plant-like in certain ways. And every 1,000 years, there's going to be another phase transition into a much higher reality until the 10th millennium. In the 10th millennium, just like we can hardly imagine what's going to happen in the 7th millennium, we definitely don't know what's going to go on in the 10th millennium. But the Kabbalah hints at the fact that the entire transcendent phase will permeate into the immanent phase, creating a wholeness that is extraordinarily difficult for us to imagine what that could look like. And it raises the question, which I don't have an answer to, what happens in the 10th millennium then to individual consciousness? Does everything go back to square one before the creation? In which case you can ask, what was the purpose of the creation to begin with? But this is a question which it would be hubris for me to even attempt to see what that could look like. And I have to accept the fact that I don't know. I'm not even sure what the 7th millennium is going to look like. And there are controversies between, for example, Maimonides and Nachmanides, between how much are the laws of nature going to change as we enter into the Messianic millennium. Some feel there are going to be a lot of changes, and others say, no, there's going to be changes in human behavior and in ethics, and maybe there won't be as much warfare in the world, or none at all, hopefully. And whether the laws of physics are going to bend, I don't know. There's controversy on that. So that's the 7th millennium. So the 10th millennium.
And the spark of God, or this particle, or whatever we call it, of consciousness, which is pervading everything, which is part of panpsychist model. Do you think that, or what Kabbalah says, will we ever be able to measure that, or it's not measurable in principle?
Well, I don't think it's measurable in principle because I don't believe that consciousness is part of the physical world. It's not coded in your genes per se. It's not part of the periodic table. I think it is immaterial. And therefore, we don't have the tools to objectively measure it. We can learn a lot about it. Most of human reality is subjective. If we were to expunge subjectivity from human existence, I don't know, you wouldn't have much left. You'd have about, 98 cents worth of chemicals. Much of our reality is subjective, and we can learn a fantastic amount, not from a scientist, maybe from a poet or a great artist, musician could teach us about the subjective realm. But we don't have tools to measure it physically because I don't believe it is ensconced within the material world.
Yeah, the reason I ask is that not long ago, if we told people that we would be looking for God's particle, they would laugh at us, right?
The Higgs boson, God's particle, I guess it was called that somewhat tongue-in-cheek because it was a particle that, I'm not a physicist, but it was supposed to imbue all particles with mass. So because of that primal function of the Higgs boson, it was then therefore called God particle, gave mass to everything. But I don't think it has really anything to do with spirituality directly. Although, by that picture of the signet ring metaphor, there has to be spiritual correlates of the Higgs boson in every one of the worlds created by God. What it means in the world of creation or the world of emanation, I don't know. I'm not there. I can't see that. Maybe some prophets can. In fact, different prophets, they apparently, I write about this in my book, they differ in their degree of prophecy. Some are able to reach the very top of the world of Bria, creation. Others reach low down in the world of Bria. Some can only reach the level of Yetzirah. So not all prophets were sort of created equal in that sense. And that's not surprising. Not every person's intellect is equal. Right? I mean, obviously, there are differences. So too for prophecy.
I have a tricky question, which I ask every interviewee. Because we talked about it, you mentioned a lot, the terminology consciousness, but what can you define consciousness? What is consciousness actually? Does Kabbalah define consciousness?
Yeah. I would say that to define consciousness, you could construe it as the revelation of the mind of God via the three top sephirot of every decasephirotic system. It's the movement of the unity of God, the mind of God, God of our traditions, through this Rudla membrane that moves from the transcendent phase into the immanent phase, which gives us our consciousness, which gives an animal its consciousness, a plant, a rock, its consciousness.
Can we study consciousness, in your view?
Yes, but not with scientific instrumentation. Reading good poetry, or read William James, read psychology, and then you can have some understanding of what consciousness is. Meditate. Judaism isn't necessarily one of them, although there is some meditative aspects to Judaism, but there are some wonderful Eastern philosophies that have developed the meditative arts to an incredible degree. And they will have insights into consciousness that the Western mind can't possibly see, and I'm not sure they have any physical tools to do it. They're doing it through consciousness itself. So the tool with which to study consciousness is consciousness.
Everything to study it. You can only study with consciousness. But I'm into science. What do we do with science going forward? Because currently it seems to exclude, for the most part, consciousness out of the picture. And that becomes a predicament in itself. So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So what do we do with science then?
In the past, scientists did not have, I'm talking about the remote past, Middle Ages, scientists didn't have trouble conflating the sciences of the times with theology.
Well, they did. They had Inquisition, so they did have a lot of problems.
But there were areas of friction. But the scientist himself had room in his mind for both God and science. The scientist himself or herself. And then it came a little bit, that was Middle Ages. At the time of Descartes, Descartes also agreed that there's a rex cogitans, rex extensa, there's a soul and there's a material world. He accepted both. He just felt that they should be compartmental. There's separate compartments. That's Cartesian dualism, basically. But moving into the 20th century, science went a little further with logical positivism, and now, of course, scientific reductionism that is trying to expunge the enterprise of science of all things spiritual, of all things godly. And that's what we're seeing, and that's why they're so uncomfortable with the anthropic principle, because it's screaming out for a creator, in my opinion. They may not see it that way. I'm sure they don't. But that's why they're invoking multiverses to try to explain this exquisite fine-tuning. So this is what I mean by the soul has been sort of squeezed out of the sciences, because the majority of scientists today would balk at the idea of talking about souls. But keep in mind that 30 years ago, if you were a neuroscience graduate student and you wanted to write a PhD thesis on consciousness, a lot of people would dissuade you from doing so. It would be a dead end to tenure, for example, at a university. People didn't like the idea because it's subjective. That's changed. And with it has changed the acceptance, more so today than 20 years ago, of panpsychism. Panpsychism isn't a new idea. It existed centuries ago, but not in the 20th century until the last 20, 30 years. And Bernardo Kastrup, for example, has been doing wonderful work with the Essentia Foundation and elsewhere, pushing the notion of idealism, which is, to me, even more or less materialistic even than panpsychism. See, I don't accept pure idealism. My view, or the Kabbalistic view, I think, is more like dual aspect monism, where there is a physical side because the 7 lower sephirot are bodily, and the top 3 are the consciousness. So they're fused. It's not just consciousness.
Interesting. You believe in God. You believe in God, right? We can say that you believe in God, right? Well, whatever God is, because that's another tricky question. What is God, right? How does it work? Because you're a scientist, so you combine rational reductionist science with irrational and sort of ever expanding view in divine. How does it work for you?
Well, first, I might not use the word irrational. I might use supra-rational, transcendent, if you will. And that's because, as I try to emphasize several times in the course of my presentation, I think the idea that there is a divine mind that created the universe and is regulating it from second to second is based on science, a very plausible attitude today. It may not have been at the heyday of Newtonian mechanics, when there was no need to consider how there could be ontic paradox, how light can be a particle and a wave, how there can be entanglement. Entanglement, that's a very strange concept. Not so if you understand the Kabbalah. It's the concept of hitkashrut, interpenetration, that's all. Now being revealed through science. So I have no problem with it. In fact, I will guess that 30, 40 years from now, it'll be even easier to invoke this Keter Malchut axis. That's what's missing from our understanding, in my opinion, of reality. We understand 4 of the axes. Chochma Bina, which is one axis, time. Chesed Gvura, one of the axes of space. Tiferet Yesod, another axis of space. Netzach Hod, the third axis of space. So we have 4 out of 5 axes. Science is doing great. We have great understanding. What's missing is this Keter Malchut, holiness, coming in from outside the material world and influencing the world, specifically the divine feminine Malchut, to create a universe according to God's design, not ours.
You know, I think in some ways, people who study Kabbalah or who adhere to Kabbalah have a kind of easy thing in life, because according to Kabbalah, we have a beautiful purpose of healing and restoring broken vessels through our good intentions, through our good deeds, through our good thoughts. So the whole problem of what's my purpose in life is sort of taken care of, right? By Kabbalah in some ways. But what does it do for you personally as a neuroscientist? How does Kabbalah inform your life?
Well, it forms my life both professionally and personally. Personally, for the reasons you just alluded to, it's an extraordinary optimistic way to go through life in many ways. And that's because God wanted us to benefit from our existence if we do things right. Right? Professionally, I also sort of alluded to the fact that I do not limit myself in my scientific thinking about consciousness and other areas. I do not limit myself to material reality. I accept the fact that there are non-material aspects that are as real as atoms and quarks and electrons, but they're just not physical. And that informs my every thinking. Even disease, I'm a neurologist, so I think about human disease. And I think about what might be the role of the transcendent aspects of the light that penetrates into the immanent phase. For example, in the case of schizophrenia, that's a good example, you might have a situation where you have a mismatch between the light coming into the vessel and the vessel. So the vessel may be fine in a schizophrenic brain, but for some reason, the disease, there's a permeabilization of this Rudla membrane, allowing far too much light to penetrate from the surround into the immanent phase, which results in an actual shattering of the vessel, a shvirat hakelim, as the Kabbalah calls it, where the brain of that person isn't strong enough to hold that measure of light. And so there's disease. And vice versa. There may be diseases like Alzheimer's, where the vessel, yes, we think it's broken, and under the microscope, the brain does not look normal. There are plaques, senile plaques filled with amyloid and neurofibrillary tangles and all of the other pathologies that we know happen in the Alzheimer-affected brain. But there may also be the possibility that for whatever reason, on a spiritual level even, this Rudla is somewhat hardened and not enough light, the opposite of schizophrenia, not enough light can penetrate into the vessel. And so the vessel is impoverished. But for some reason, there can be, because it's a spiritual entity, it's not necessarily irreversibly damaged like the physical. So there could be a transient opening up of this Rudla membrane, allowing more light in, which might be a spiritual a way of understanding this idea of terminal lucidity that you sometimes see in an Alzheimer patient, where the patient for 5 years couldn't remember his wife's name. And then all of a sudden, maybe, towards the end of the illness, suddenly remembers the name. What happened? Well, if it's just a problem of brain degeneration, why should it? It doesn't regenerate. But if it's the problem of the relationship between the immanent part of consciousness and what's outside, the transcendent phase, you can speculate that perhaps even in a terminal patient, there could be this opening, increased porosity of the radla, which then allows light to enter, giving you a lucid interval. And the same thing may be true for near-death experiences. I could conjecture that near-death experiences may have a similar underlying Kabbalistic metaphysic.
So we are sort of piercing through the veil, actually, and you don't need you don't need a fully functioning brain for it. A late stage is hardly functioning brain, I would say. That's true. I'm not a scientist, but that's what I heard tell us.
But you do need a vessel matched to the light. The like I showed you that mug made out of ice holding water. If the water that pours in is too hot, it'll break through the vessel. It'll melt through the bottom of the vessel. And if for some reason your spout, your radla is too tight, not enough you'll waste the potential of that vessel for lack of light entering into it. So you need a match. And I believe the halacha, which is the law, Torah law, is designed, in my opinion, is to best match the light with the vessel and allow you to then navigate life in the most optimistic, best possible way by matching those two components, the light and the vessel.
I want to go back to science again. It sort of bothers me that you said the soul has left science. So what kind of future should we strive for in science? How can we bring soul back, in your view?
Well, I think if things keep moving the way they're moving, with our beginning to appreciate concepts such as consciousness as being real and not epiphenomena, and that there might be a lot of truth to panpsychism, that is a very important first step towards looking at reality through purely physical or materialistic eyes. It opens a crack which allows for spiritual light now to possibly enter into our thinking. I truly believe that Einstein's quest for a theory of everything, where all the forces of nature are combined, will not be realized until this fifth axis of reality between Keter and Malchut, transcendence, spirituality, and its combination with the physical world. Until that axis is in place, we will not have a true theory of everything. But I think what we're told, or what we're asked to believe, is that when we enter into this messianic age, this is exactly where we're going to be heading. And that what we're asking now and what we're trying to answer by way of conjecture will become manifest and apparent within the next several hundred years.
Anyway, that's God's will, right? Not much we can say about that. I mean, we could try, of course. One more question. What advice would you give to going forward? You as a scientist and you as somebody who holds the belief of Kabbalah, or at least theoretically, you say you're not a practitioner, but still, what kind of advice would you give to your young colleagues, to your scientists on their path?
Well, I'll start by answering by saying I don't think the Kabbalah is for everybody. I don't. I don't even think it's certainly originated in Jewish sources, but the vast majority of Jews do not learn Kabbalah. Even the Orthodox Jews, many of them don't learn Kabbalah. It's too esoteric. It's not their thing, okay? There is some understanding of Kabbalah that comes through, as I mentioned at the very beginning in my introductory comments, through Hasidism. Hasidic philosophy does have some Kabbalah lots of Kabbalah in it, but it was blended with more everyday type of Jewish philosophy and Jewish observance. It's a blend, so it's not pure in that sense, unembodied Kabbalah, which is not really for everybody. So I'm not suggesting that everybody needs to learn this to live a full, complete, optimistic, wonderful life. I think for people who do understand it, it does offer these things, but it's not necessary. I think the advice I'd give to young students today in the sciences is basically what I alluded to a few minutes ago. Science is wonderful. You can learn a tremendous amount. It's a pathway to truth, but it's not the only pathway. And I refuse to accept that anything that isn't potentially falsifiable is not worth learning. As I mentioned, a huge part of our existence, maybe the most wonderful part, love, for example, go objectify, go measure it. Go find an instrument that measures exactly how much love that this husband has for this wife. Give it to me in numerical form. No. So that's my advice, is keep an open mind, allow for subjectivity to be viewed, construed as real as the objective universe. And I think it'll be easier and easier for you to be accepted as a student today, looking at reality as being bimodal, material and spiritual, than it was even 30 years ago. So that's basically the advice. Make room for the immaterial, for the spiritual, and enjoy your lives.
Hyman, thank you very much for this interview, for this in-depth view of Kabbalah with your personal story and your personal outlook. And I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you very much.
So did I, and I thank you very much for this opportunity.